Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Governors Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation and Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're presenting the second in a two-part webinar series exploring international and domestic threats confronting America and our homeland security. We kicked off the series last week looking at the international landscape and geopolitical threats to democracy. In today's discussions, our experts will consider America's domestic threats, asking whether these are connected to the international players we discussed last week, and also what Homeland Security professionals can do in their jobs every day in this hyper-polarized environment. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for today's webinar. First, our moderator, Mike Walker. Mike is a subject matter expert and frequent lecturer in the classroom at CHDS, focusing on all hazard threats. Mike served 32 years in the federal government and was confirmed 4 times by the United States Senate to serve in senior executive branch positions. At the Pentagon, Mike worked as acting secretary of the Army and also served as undersecretary of the Army and in several other senior national security positions. Mike also served as deputy director of FEMA and as undersecretary of Veterans Affairs for Memorial Affairs. He retired from that position after serving in the federal government for 32 years. On Capitol Hill, Mike served as staff director for the Senate Subcommittee on Military Construction Appropriations, and he was also one of the founders here at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security. So Mike, welcome back, and thank you for moderating today's discussion.
Thank you.
And our featured guest today is Dr. Seth Jones. Seth is an instructor of comparative government for Homeland Security here at CHDS, and also the Senior Vice President, Harold Brown Chair, and Director of International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Seth was the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, and he also served as representative for the commander, U.S. Special Operations Command, to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Seth has authored countless books and articles on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and covert actions. Seth, thank you also for joining us today and for bringing a wealth of experience as we turn our conversations to threats here at home and we discuss what all of this could mean for the nation's homeland security leaders. Mike, I'd like to turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Dawn. 20 years ago, when the Center for Homeland Defense and Security was first established, the threat to the homeland was very clear. Violent jihadists had attacked us on 9/11. Today, the threat is much more complex. We're going to explore some elements of that threat in the next hour. And let's start with the threat that brought us here in the first place, the violent jihadist threat. 20 years ago, some analysts believed that violent jihadists actually represented an existential threat. It did not turn out to be that way. In the last 20 years, we first saw major setbacks for Al-Qaeda. Then, after ISIS emerged and took substantial territory in Iraq and Syria, they too suffered serious setbacks. But the truth is, the jihadists are not defeated, even though we keep killing the leaders of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The reality is we continue to see Al-Qaeda franchises and ISIS branches still operating in many parts of the world. And last year, a senior National Security Council advisor estimated that global jihadists are launching an average of 10 attacks every day somewhere in the world. And Seth Jones' team at CSIS found that there may be 4 times more jihadists in the world today than there were on 9/11. So with that lead in, Seth, how do you assess the global jihadist threat today? And could we see ISIS and Al-Qaeda reconstitute? And if they do, how will we conduct counterterrorism operations against them, since we no longer have a presence in Afghanistan and only a limited presence in Iraq?
Mike, thanks for the questions, and Dawn, thanks for the introduction. It's obviously a major honor to participate in this with a great group of individuals participating here, and I have always enjoyed my teaching and working with students and others at the Center for Homeland Defense of the Naval Postgraduate School. So let me just make a couple of comments on the global jihadist picture to start us off. One is that when we look overseas, the threat is still concerning. It's certainly evolved in ways that I'll unpack, but it is concerning. If we look at probably the biggest band of areas of concern, they are from really Northwest and East Africa up through the Middle East and into South Asia. So we still see a lot of activity in Sahel, for example, in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, based on groups like JNIM, which is an Al-Qaeda linked group led by Ira Ghali. We've seen an increase in activity, including as the French, as part of Operation Barkhane, have reduced their footprint in the region. We've seen an expansion of jihadist control of territory as well as attacks. We still continue to see Islamic State activity in Libya. It's not a huge amount. It's certainly much smaller than 5 or 6 years ago, after some pretty heavy U.S. activity in Libya. We see plenty of activity from Boko Haram in Nigeria, along Nigeria's northeastern borders with Niger and Chad. If we move to a few other areas of Africa, there's some activity in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then a few areas further south in Africa. But the biggest areas in Africa, in addition to the Sahel and North Africa, are in the Horn, where we see an active Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, conducting attacks in and around Mogadishu, in the south, including in the Juba River, as well as in neighboring Kenya in particular. As we move up into Yemen, into the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, still a fair amount of activity as part of the civil war in Yemen from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The Iraq and Syria areas are a major hotbed of jihadist activity, especially Syria in the Idlib area, though we have seen broader Islamic State activity in other areas of Syria, including in the desert regions. We have seen also an uptick in attacks in Iraq from Islamic State activity. There are a number of Al-Qaeda groups, again, operating in Idlib around the Turkish border. And then, and we can talk about Afghanistan in a moment, but we certainly see concerns with the overthrow of the Taliban government by a Taliban regime that has very close ties to Al-Qaeda. And we've seen Islamic State very active. We've seen a number of other things in the Pacific, including in Indonesia. But that's a little bit of the global laydown. I mean, it's worth noting, Mike, that when we look at Al-Qaeda and Islamic State attacks, we've actually seen a decline overall in Al-Qaeda's main attacks over the last decade. 2021, last year, was we saw the smallest number of Al-Qaeda attacks in at least the last decade. The same is not true for the Islamic State, where we actually have seen the slope of the curve of attacks actually go in the other direction, which is we've seen a major increase. In fact, the largest number of attacks that we have in our database for the Islamic State in the last 10 years was in 2021. Actually, in the last 5 years was in 2021. And they are primarily in the Middle East, including Iraq and Syria, as well as lots of activity in South Asia, Afghanistan, and then also in the Sahel, where we've seen a range of activity. I mean, two other quick comments just on the global picture. The U.S. is withdrawing its forces and already has from Africa. There's every indication that the U.S. will do the same in the Middle East, particularly as the U.S. pivots to the Indo-Pacific and into Europe to deal with the Russian threat in Ukraine. So this will almost certainly give jihadists a bit more room to operate over the next couple of years, because there'll be a decline of US and other partner forces. I mentioned earlier, decline in French forces, which have been pretty lethal in the Sahel in West Africa. And then just finally, third, Mike, probably worth noting that just shifting from the jihadists, we still see a lot of Shia activity. Hezbollah, Houthi attacks, Shia groups based in Iraq. So there's a lot of activity. Those are generally supported, money, weapons, technology, by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force, which is the main paramilitary arm of the Iranian military. They have funded a range of groups and work with them. So we do have the Shia in a range of areas as well. So pretty dangerous environment, particularly in areas where we're seeing the withdrawal of US forces.
Seth, with regard to Al-Qaeda, this relationship, this historical relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, raises real issues. And now the head of security in the Taliban government is the Haqqani group, which is very closely tied to Al-Qaeda. So how long could it be before Al-Qaeda becomes a threat to us again?
Well, Mike, U.S. Officials have estimated, based on intelligence, U.S. intelligence, including last week, in the statement before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Frank McKenzie, the U.S. Central Command commander, noted that with Al-Qaeda, they may have external operations capabilities based out of Afghanistan within the next 12 and certainly the next 24 months to conduct attacks outside of the country. As you rightly noted, Mike, the head of the Ministry of Interior in the Taliban government is Siraj Haqqani. He's a U.S. designated terrorist with very close historical links to Al-Qaeda's senior leadership, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda. That job, that Ministry of Interior job, is the rough equivalent in the US of, I would say, a combination of the FBI director and the DHS secretary. So it's with actually some State Department functions, because they deal with visas as well. So it's a very important role. If you look at the numbers, even over the last year, the UN Security Council assesses a doubling of Al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan just since the collapse of the government, which is less than a year ago. We've seen the move of some senior Al-Qaeda officials like Saif al-Adil from Iran. These were members of the Management Council that had gone to Iran after the Taliban collapse in 2001. They've moved back into Afghanistan since the Taliban retook control of the country. So we've also seen some individuals move back, senior Al-Qaeda leaders move back. And so, when we're looking at training camps for Al-Qaeda, provinces like Ghazni, Helmand, Kandahar, Nimruz, Paktika, Zabul are all areas where there is some concern about the potential for training camps. And remember that when it comes to attacks and plots in the US, 2009, the Najibullah Zazi plot in New York City, 2010, Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, both of those went directly back to the Afghan-Pakistan border region, including 9/11 as well. So history of plots and attacks coming from this region. And it is also worth noting that though the US has talked about having some over the horizon capabilities, I am not aware of a single strike, US strike in Afghanistan since the cataclysmic and failed attack after the US Marines were killed, where the US accidentally actually killed a former US government contractor. They thought he was an ISIS supporter and operative, targeted him with an MQ-9A Reaper, a drone, armed drone, killed children as well. And the challenge in Afghanistan is with this potential for resurgence of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS Khorasan province. The US has no bases in the vicinity. They've got to fly from the Persian Gulf, which is which gives those MQ-9s very little loitering time over Afghan territory. In addition, there's no partner force on the ground in Afghanistan. They've all either been killed, fled, or in a few cases joined the Taliban, even a small number that have joined ISIS. And you know, there's no broader intelligence architecture. So it's a really tough position. I think just to put a fine point on it, the CENTCOM commander, Frank McKenzie, said back in December that the US has somewhere between 1% to 2% of the intelligence picture in Afghanistan for terrorists that it had a year ago. So it's essentially flying blind in an area that there is growing concern about not just terrorist activity, but external operations capability. So I think Afghanistan will be certainly a major country to keep an eye on that may go back to the homeland in terms of the threat.
Seth, let's take a quick look at the homegrown threat. After 9/11, we saw a large number of homegrown violent jihadist cases here in the United States. But after 2015, it peaked, and it's been declining ever since. What do you expect will happen in this country if ISIS and Al-Qaeda resurge overseas?
Well, I think it is possible if they resurge, if they're able to conduct attacks, that we might see an increase, particularly in inspired attacks. We have seen a notable decline in jihadist attacks in the US over the past couple of years. I mean, our database shows that the vast majority of plots, domestic terrorism plots and attacks are coming from US-based individuals and networks, not jihadists, not Al-Qaeda, not Islamic State. There probably are a few reasons for that. One is the loss of territory by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and a few other places. They've lost territory in Libya. In addition, there have been pretty successful operations over the past few years, particularly against ISIS, to take out the leadership. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. His successor was recently killed by the US. The US has also conducted strikes against some of the key external operations facilitators of the Islamic State overseas, including in Syria as well as Iraq. So those things have contributed probably to it's not a winning cause to be joining. And if you're in the US and would like to conduct an inspired attack, kind of the way we saw in Orlando or San Bernardino, California, or even in New York with the Halloween attack a couple of years ago, as a vehicle-borne attack, it's not a winning cause right now. Now, Mike, as you alluded to, though, it's possible that could change. The US, again, is withdrawing from, or has completely withdrawn from most of these areas. So if we do see a surge in activity, attacks, external attacks from those areas, or the seizure of territory, much like we saw in 2014, 2015, 2016 in Syria and Iraq, that may inspire individuals to conduct attacks overseas in Europe or the US. I still find it unlikely at this point, based on a lot of the successes in the US homeland, including at the borders, particularly flying in, the no-fly list, the establishment of the National Counterterrorism Center. I find it very hard to believe that it will be easy for Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to conduct a directed attack in the US, much like 9/11 or like the November 2015 attack in Paris that ISIS was able to perpetrate, targeting soccer stadium, targeting clubs and restaurants. I mean, that was a serious active shooter terrorist attack, well planned by ISIS and then conducted. I think it'd be very hard to pull off and send individuals into the US today, which to me still makes those inspired attacks more likely.
Let's shift to domestic violent extremists. Before January 6th, the news media was focused on Antifa as being the most dangerous domestic extremism threat here in the United States. In 2020, 500,000 people petitioned the White House to designate Antifa to be a terrorist organization. But the FBI director says Antifa is not an organization at all, but is instead a movement or an ideology. So what is Antifa, Seth, and what is the threat posed by violent Antifa adherents here in America?
Well, as many people here probably know, Antifa is historically, it's a contraction of the phrase anti-fascist. And so it refers not to a group per se, but to a decentralized network of individuals that oppose fascism, racism, and other related ideologies. Adherents have also been motivated by such philosophies as communism and anarchism. The history does date back to at least the period after World War I, when German and Italian leftist groups worked together to fight fascist gangs in Europe. There were a number of anti-fascist organizations in Italy and, probably not surprisingly, Germany. Probably the most iconic incident occurred outside of London on October 4th, 1936, in what became known as the Battle of Cable Street. And on that day, Oswald Mosley led the British Union of Fascists in a march on Cable Street and Whitechapel in London. It was in the East End. And in response, tens of thousands of individuals, socialists, anarchists, and others, even just outraged nearby residents, formed a blockade and fought Mosley's fascists and some 6,000 police officers. They lobbed homemade grenades, threw an assortment of projectiles, including rocks, chamber pots. They tossed marbles at the feet of police horses. And so, we saw this kind of anti-fascist evolution continue up through the rise of Adolf Hitler and the onset of World War II. Then they declined a bit post 1945 in the US. Obviously, the Nazi state is defeated in Germany. Hitler commits suicide, but we do see them start to reemerge in the 1970s, and then particularly over the last couple of years have seen an increase in individuals with this ideology in the US. We've seen them in the Pacific Northwest. We've seen individuals operating in local networks, including the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club, which describes itself as an anti-fascist, anti-racist, pro-worker community defense organization. And I'm just reading right now what they then commit to, quote, active resistance to the corrosive and destructive social effects of white supremacy, sexism, bigotry, and economic exploitation, end quote. So, I mean, what I would say is kind of interesting is our data, which we'll publish from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, probably in April, actually does show, while we haven't seen a ton of anti-fascist and even anarchist involvement in domestic terrorist attacks and plots. Historically, there actually was an uptick in 2021, a notable uptick, and it's generally in a number of US cities, including, but not only in the Pacific Northwest, as they face off against kind of violent white supremacists and some other, what you might call violent far-right individuals in cities,
So,
which I think we'll talk about in a moment.
yeah, yeah. So only one person so far, according to data by CSIS, only one person in the United States has ever been killed by an Antifa supporter. Do you think that may change?
Yes, I think that definitely may change based on the trends we're seeing in 2021, which at the very least, Mike, is seeing an increase in violence by anti-fascists and anarchists against those on the violent or extreme right. So I think that's probably the most likely place where we'd see deaths if they were to happen. I mean, part of the other thing is, well, we certainly see anti-fascists and others using lethal weapons. We also see them using a lot of what we call melee weapons, so knives and blunt instruments like hammers, as well as incendiaries that aren't necessarily meant to kill people per se, but are meant to burn things down. We have seen them bring weapons, including firearms, to protests, and that does certainly raise the prospect in what you might call a security dilemma, where there is a tit for tat violence between extremists on multiple sides. That does raise the prospect, Mike, for deaths caused by anti-fascists and or anarchists and others along those same lines.
Last year, Seth, the intelligence community assessed that the main threat was not coming from anti-fascists, but from violent white supremacists and militia violent extremists. Does your research show the same thing?
Yeah, what it shows, Mike, is that up through 2020, at least in 2020, as we can see here, that about 3/4 of the domestic terrorist attacks and plots have been white supremacists, anti-government militias, and other related individuals. I mean, I would highlight here that that while the radicalization process for individuals, and all of these are extremists, because to get into this data set, you have to either use violence or the threat of violence, as even if you look at the definition under US code, this is about violence. So this is illegal activity. So what we've seen though is, while radicalization may involve groups and certainly networks, violence itself is generally an individual act, or at least a small number. So when we note here a reasonable percentage of individuals involved in, about 3/4 in 2020 involved in the attacks coming from the violent far right, and that means white supremacists and anti-government militias, that does not mean groups per se. That means individuals that are perpetrating these attacks. But two other things of note here. One is that, as folks can see here, there actually has been a notable increase over the past couple of years on domestic terrorist attacks and plots. So 2020 was actually the highest year on record, at least since 1994 in this graph. This is our data set of attacks and plots. So the numbers are growing, or at least we're growing up through 2020 on attacks and plots. The number of fatalities, Mike, is actually not at all-time highs, at least in the past 30 years. They've actually been somewhat lower than the norm, probably because It's the jihadists that kill most people in the US in attacks. Most violent far right and far left individuals have generally killed very small numbers of people. They've been very targeted uses of violence, which happy to talk about in more detail. That's why the fatalities have been a little bit lower. And then just one final note so that people are aware. What's interesting is in 2021, we are seeing those on the violent far left commit a growing percentage of attacks. Out of the terrorist attacks in 2021, out of all of them in our data set, 49%, which is a decrease, were motivated by white supremacists and other related groups. 31%, which is a big uptick, were motivated by those on the violent far left, and only about 3% came from violent, from Salafi jihadists. So it's the way we started this conversation. So the situation is even evolving a little bit in the 2021 period.
So Seth, let's drill down and take a look at the white supremacist threat, and in particular, these so-called violent accelerationists who are very concerned about demographic trends showing that the white race is going to become a minority in 25 years, and who believe there's a conspiracy to replace the white race, and who believe there needs to be a race war to change that. We've seen a number of white supremacists who have launched or planned attacks in recent years who have left behind manifestos or other writings indicating that they hoped that their attacks would lead to a race war that would result in a new white ethno-state in the United States. So what can you tell us about this aspect of the threat?
Well, it is the highest percentage of plots and attacks that we continue to see, even if the overall percentage has declined a little bit in 2021. It's the highest percentage. I think we're also seeing, Mike, that these individuals are increasingly cooperating. So we see manifestos not just in the US, but overseas. So we see lots of cooperation with white supremacists and other accelerationists in New Zealand, Australia, definitely Europe, where we see activity in Nordic countries, in the UK, and in several other European countries. We've also seen it in and around Ukraine, including supported by the Russians. In the US, there continue to be a range of drivers for this. One is continuing concerns about immigration. And this is not just individuals coming in from Latin America, so Central America or South America, across the US-Mexican border, though we have seen certainly attacks at, say, a Walmart in the El Paso area that are specific to immigrants. We've also seen some on the white supremacist side express concern for both Republicans and Democrats that were willing to bring in Afghan immigrants into the US last year after the collapse of the Afghan government to the Taliban regime. The white supremacists have also been energized by the election of the Biden administration and having an African-American vice president, as well as a range of African-American senior officials, US ambassador to the United Nations, potential Supreme Court judge as well. These have all been motivating factors. The 2020, protests after the death of George Floyd and the continuing rise in the Black Lives Matter movement was an inspiration to white supremacists. So I think what a range of these factors, and a number of them have also been energized just by some broader political issues over the past couple of years. I think we see a robust movement and a lot of interaction between organizations in the US and those overseas.
Yeah, you mentioned that. It actually goes back to the early 2000s when David Duke actually lived in Moscow for several years. And by 2005, he was an open supporter of Vladimir Putin. And since then, in 2015, we saw the A team, that's what I call them, the A team of white nationalist leaders from all over the world meeting in St. Petersburg, Russia, to establish an international network. And those meetings were actually paid for by a far-right political party in Russia that had originally been founded by Dmitry Rogozin, who in 2015 was Putin's deputy prime minister. And then 2 years later, we heard the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville, openly chanting, "Russia is our friend." And just before Charlottesville, David Duke spoke to the largest white supremacist group called the League of the South and publicly proclaimed that Russia holds the key to white survival. And, we saw the Internet Research Agency actually before the 2016 election. Their largest attack in this country, at least on Twitter, was in Ferguson, Missouri, to stir up racial tension there. And we saw during the election in 2016, the Russian Internet Research Agency actually organized fake rallies in several American cities that were specifically designed to pit white supremacists against minorities. And in 2020, there were reports that official Russian intelligence agencies were trying to stir up racial tension. And last year, the foreign minister Lavrov himself talked about anti-white racism in America. So the Russians are directly stirring the white supremacist pot, at least in the United States and Europe and other places.
Yeah, Mike, there's no question. And we've seen the Russians involved in several different ways. First, there have been Russian intelligence organizations. Two of the main ones are the FBR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Agency. Another is the GRU, the main intelligence directorate. That's the rough equivalent of the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA. Both of those organizations have been involved in on digital platforms, pushing out information to a range of different types of networks. They've tried pushing out information on what's essentially white supremacist propaganda to veterans, to different types of religious groups in the U.S., including Christians, different types of Christian sects and denominations. We've also seen, as you know, Mike, that there are informal networks with close ties to the Russian government, including the Kremlin, like the Internet Research Agency, or IRA, whose one of its primary leaders, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is and continues to be a close friend of Vladimir Putin. So they've also pushed a lot of this. The most active area really is trying to manipulate individuals with what are essentially fake, either Russian government or Russian, indirect government through the Internet Research Agency, Twitter handles, Facebook pages, Instagram, TikTok, other types of platforms where they're pushing out. I mean, they obviously don't say that they are either connected to Russia, funded by Russia, or even white supremacists, but that is what they're pushing out. And that's what they're encouraging individuals to read. And, for anybody that spent time on any of the video reels, including TikTok, once you start looking at those videos for any length of time, you start getting fed through the algorithms more and more of that information. So they're designed to continue to push that information to readers, including very young readers. And that's also a concern, Mike, is that there's some of this that is impacting and certainly reaching young people, children in the U.S. There's also this growing concern about Ukraine. If you go back about 2 years, the Sufan group put out a map of foreign fighters in Ukraine, highlighting 15,000 foreign fighters from Russia getting trained in Ukraine, and then a number of hundreds of others from Belarus, Germany, Serbia, Moldova, France, that have conducted training, often with white supremacists or other groups, either pro-Ukrainian government or pro-Russian separatist governments, and go to training camps in the Donbass or even in other areas of Ukraine, and coming out with improved networks, operational security capabilities, sniper training. And it is certainly a worry with the Ukraine war right now that it will be a battlefield that others, including those on the white supremacist side, are already going to for combat training as well, and may leave and go back to their countries of origin. So that will be a concern moving forward as well.
You bet. Well, we're running out of time, Seth, but let's talk about the potential vulnerabilities to our cyber infrastructure here at home. There's a great deal of concern that Russia, associated with Ukraine, could attack us here. How vulnerable is our electric power grid now?
Well, I think our critical infrastructure, including the electricity grid, is definitely vulnerable to Russian offensive cyber attacks, including Chinese as well. One of the things that may act as a bit of a deterrent is what one would assume is U.S. malware in Russian and Chinese critical infrastructure as well. So for those that remember mutually assured destruction during the Cold War with nuclear weapons, where the Russians had nuclear weapons that they had pointed at the United States, but the United States had nuclear weapons also pointed at the Soviet Union. And when you have a second strike capability, you have what you call mutually assured destruction. So there are some similarities, not entirely, but some similarities on the cyber end, if you're able to get malware into your opponent's critical infrastructure. There is a deterrent to activating it if you have the capability to take down their critical infrastructure as well. Now, where this might get to be a challenge is, as anybody that's been following the news recently, Mike, has noted, the Russians are really struggling in Ukraine right now. The number of deaths that NATO released yesterday by Russian forces is up at as high as 14,000. And note that is that's more than 3 times, almost 4 times as high in a month as what the US lost in Iraq and Afghanistan combined in 20 years. So it's an order of magnitude higher. And in addition, when you add the sanctions and the political isolation, remember, the Russians can't participate in the World Cup this year of soccer, the highest watched sporting event in the world, just one example of the political isolation. If this really starts to impact the regime of Putin, of Vladimir Putin, and it's about survival, we may see the Russians really start to lash out at countries, including the US, that are providing the very weapon systems that the Ukrainians are using, javelins, stingers, NLAWs, the new Switchblade drones that are used to kill Russian soldiers on the ground. So this escalation may actually trigger something a little more serious in the US, Mike.
Let me mention one more question, and then let's open it up for questions from the audience. Every day, Homeland Security practitioners and members of the military as well are bombarded with disinformation, hyperpartisanship, and even extremist recruiting. And that can make our jobs rather difficult. So what is your advice, Seth, to everyone watching about how to best deal with this very challenging environment today? They may be attacking you right now because your signal's not as good as it was.
Well, Mike, I've been hit the last couple of days, so I wouldn't be surprised. This is a case study right now of cyber operations. Actually, I mean that seriously. Well, Mike, two things here that are worth noting. One is that I think everyone, whether they're in federal agencies, whether they're in state and local law enforcement or other government agencies, or even just general citizens, really need to make sure they're getting, they're double and triple checking where their sources of news are coming from and sources of information. It should be balanced. It's just dangerous. Psychology tells us to listen and get information only from what you call echo chambers, sources that you feel politically comfortable with. That is that you want balance. You want information from multiple different sources, maybe even outside of the US, the BBC in the UK, CBC in Canada, Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, Australian News. So other sources of information so that you're getting, different types. Second is, I think it's generally a terrible idea to get news information from digital platforms. You really need to be getting your information from, sources of information that have vetted editors that generally do some kind of fact checking, rather than, digital platforms where you don't entirely always know, someone's tweet is generally a really bad place to get information. So I think one has to be careful about that. And there's just one last comment along these lines, Mike, which goes back to civic education. It's something that the FBI director was with us a couple of months ago talking about. And part of it goes back to our own kids, for example, or grandkids, is, helping encourage them in their school systems and just in general to ask, to fact check information. Where's it coming from? You're citing sources, data, events. Where's it coming from? So, always to be asking about those sources. It's why we encourage our students at the Naval Postgraduate School to footnote their sources, whether it's in posts or in papers. That really adds a lot of value and starts to make it harder to get disinformation, misinformation into the general public. So we can all do that for ourselves, with our families, loved ones, and others.
Well, Dawn, let's turn it over to you for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Mike and Seth. Several questions coming here asking if perhaps we're at an inflection point to revisit our definition of terrorism. That we all learned historically it was violent actions motivated by political thoughts or agendas. With Seth, I'll ask the question first to you, and then Mike, ask you as well. Particularly several questions asking about the influence, particularly of the mis and disinformation campaigns that you mentioned. Do we need to expand or broaden our definition of terrorism to include some of those influence campaigns?
Well, just briefly, I don't think we need to redefine terrorism, domestic terrorism. I still define it, and our database does, as roughly the deliberate use or threat of violence. So it could be the use or the threat of violence by non-state actors. It's a sort of a separate issue to get into state use of terrorism. Non-state actors in order to achieve political goals and to create a broader psychological impact. Most of the attacks target civilians, but I think this focus on the deliberate use or threat of violence to achieve political goals and create a broader psychological impact is true. It was true in the past. Great definitions by scholars like Bruce Hoffman who defined terrorism as the deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence, or the threat of violence in the pursuit of political change. So there are some variations on that. US code is also along the same lines. I don't think we need to redefine terrorism, whether it's international or domestic. But I think what we do need to recognize is that how individuals are radicalized and how terrorism, including domestic terrorism, is evolving, is changing, including a big uptick in the online dimension, which was not obviously true 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, the last big uptick in domestic terrorism in the 1990s, when Oklahoma City happened, we didn't have the internet, certainly not like today, and so that was never an issue. So how people are radicalizing or cooperating, talking overseas, pushing out manifesto, use of propaganda, fundraising, pushing out tactics, techniques, and procedures is definitely changing. But I don't think that means a change in the definition of how we're sort of defining it.
Mike,
I
any
agree.
additional thoughts?
No, I agree completely with Seth on that.
Seth, you just mentioned financing and fundraising, and series of questions here from the audience asking whether, and really a series of questions on both domestic actors, meaning American-based groups, as well as foreign actors. Where are you seeing the funding coming from? Has that changed in recent years? Is it traceable money with now cryptocurrency and other funding mechanisms maybe that weren't in place in the 80s and 90s? What are you seeing on how these groups are supporting their activities financially?
Well, I mean, part of what we're seeing is a range of individual donations, some criminal activity that groups are involved in. So, you know, in some cases, we do see larger donors, but based on the way that most attacks and plots are occurring, they actually don't need a ton of money. So most of the domestic terrorist networks, individuals, even groups that we're seeing, you know, they're getting a lot of their funding still from individual donations, some by lots of small donations from single individuals, in some cases, large-scale donations from wealthy individuals. But I don't think what we see a lot of is state funding for this. That I don't see. So even when we talk about the Russians, it's generally not, at least as far as I've seen, state funding for that. And as these questions noted, you know, we see the movement of funding in the cyber arena too, including in cryptocurrencies. But again, as far as I have seen, these are mostly donations in the movement of money, not sort of state support for at least domestic terrorism in the U.S.
Mike, a question for you, and Seth certainly can follow up as well. Several questioners are asking, has the line been blurred between free speech, political activism, and terrorism? And specifically, how have office holders of both parties emboldened people who might be leaning toward violent activity or potentially even terrorist activities?
Well, I agree with Seth completely that terrorism is about violence. And most politicians are not going to directly encourage violence, but by supporting some groups or other groups, they may be indirectly. So that is a problem for our democracy to take care of. And if a member of Congress or a member of the Senate or a governor is too close to extremist groups, then it's up to the voters to vote them out.
I mean,
Seth, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Don, I would just add two things to that. One is that that we have seen, not surprisingly, individuals from respective parties raise questions about, call for, and even put legislation together to ban specific types of organizations. So not surprisingly, we've seen some Republicans talk about banning fascists, anti-fascists or anarchists. I mean, the last president talked about designating Antifa as a terrorist organization. We've seen Democrats do the same, but for white supremacist organizations and some anti-government militias. I mean, the challenge there is, if we're really going to go down the road of designating, there are two challenges with it. One is a lot of the kinds of organizations we're talking about aren't really groups, they're kind of networks of individuals. So it'd be hard to do that. Second of all, you really shouldn't start off by highlighting the groups you want to designate. What we've seen in the UK and in Germany, which have designated, is that they start off with the criteria. So what are the criteria one would use, and would it, who falls into that? That would still raise a lot of questions, but that would be the apolitical way of starting to get at that. And I mean, I would say it would be really nice if we could get to a place where I think politicians from all sides of the political aisle would stop trying to defend the use of violence. I understand we have free speech in the US, but when it comes to what Mike and I have been talking about, the deliberate use or the threat of violence, well, that's illegal activity in the US. So politicians should make it very, very clear that no matter whether we're talking about violent far right, violent far left, jihadists, ethno-nationalists, anything that involves the threat or use of violence should be punished to the highest extent possible in the US. It is illegal activity. We have a judicial system that deals with that, but that we should be very clear about that. It shouldn't be political. And I will say the thing that has caused me the most concern about that is having to testify over the last year before multiple committees on House and Senate, Homeland Security, Judiciary, the Armed Services. This issue is so politically sensitive, and that it's really unhelpful. And it's unhelpful for reasons that we should be able to agree on violence as being outside of the scope of what people should be doing, but we're not quite there yet. So I hope that changes, but it is a problem right now.
Mike, Seth, one final question before I'll turn it back over to you for closing comments. We have a dozen at least questions here asking about do increases in hate crimes foreshadow increases in domestic terrorism, and several calling out recent attacks on Asian American members of our community. So Seth, I'll throw it to you first, and you and Mike are both students of history. What have you seen in your studies? Do increased numbers of hate crimes foreshadow increases in domestic terrorism?
Yeah, so great question, Dawn. Just to be clear, the definition of hate crimes is much broader than it is of the terrorism that we just outlined, including domestic terrorism. So hate crimes can also include lots of non-violent incidents, including graffiti and verbal activity that's not about violence per se or the threat of violence. So it's a much broader set of activities. I have seen no evidence that hate crimes themselves and an increase or a decrease is actually correlated with domestic terrorism. It certainly isn't helpful, and it certainly may contribute to people that then take the next step of moving from hate to violence. But from a data perspective, I have seen no evidence that increases or decreases in hate crime activity contributes to an increase or decrease in actual terrorism, which then moves us from simply the hate category to the violence category. I've seen no evidence of correlation.
I I agree with Seth about that. The problem with the hate crimes today is many police agencies are not reporting them. And the truth is, there are a lot more hate crimes than what the FBI statistics indicate. And the FBI statistics indicate they're going up. Well, there are a lot more than ever get reported. And as citizens, we need to be encouraging our police agencies to report hate crimes, and for individuals who are subject to hate crimes to report them to the police.
Mike, Seth, being mindful of time, I'd like to turn it over to you for closing thoughts and particularly messages you think that this audience of Homeland Security leaders around the country need to take away when they think about the threats here at home. Seth, I'll throw to you first.
Yeah, two final comments, Dawn, and thanks again for your questions and running this, and thanks to Mike as well. It's been fantastic to partner with him. Two quick things. One is that there is an easy tendency for all of us to focus on domestic terrorist groups and organizations. So we like to label things. The reality, I would argue, is that the landscape in the US remains very decentralized, particularly when it comes to the use of violence. So that many are inspired specifically by the concept of leaderless resistance, which strongly rejects hierarchical organization in favor of decentralized networks or individual activity. So again, we like to label Proud Boys or Antifa. The reality is when we, or plenty of other organizations, the reality is when we actually see violence used, it is generally individual in nature, and people may be inspired by some ideologies that are associated with these groups. But I do think when it comes to the use of violence, I would strongly argue that we've got to get away from just focusing on groups and organizations and get down to a much more decentralized level. The second is that one of the things that we most badly need in this country is better and more public data on trends, because it's too easy in this hyper-partisan political environment for people just to make claims when we don't have a lot of data. One of the great things about my time in Afghanistan and the military is we had a fantastic data set of significant acts, or SIGACs, where we tracked insurgent attacks, locations, and then eventually made that public. We do not have a very good public database of domestic terrorist attacks and plots. You have to rely on outside organizations generally. And so the problem is when it comes to members of Congress talking about it, that it's a lot of stuff that's either cherry picked or that's said off the cuff without actually citing the real, legitimate data. So I think we need to get to a better place where government agencies, DHS, DOJ, FBI are releasing data on targets, tactics, types of organizations and individuals that are conducting attacks, and trends over time, and lots of other factors in there. That's a really important part, I think, of moving on from a purely partisan look at this.
Mike, closing thoughts?
Well, first, I want to say thanks to Seth, because it's been great working with Seth on these two webinars. CHDS is very lucky to have Seth Jones as part of its faculty, because he is truly one of the leading experts in all of these areas we discussed over the last two seminars. Finally, during last week's webinar, I suggested that the 21st century would be known as a global struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. That's also true here in the United States. extremists on both the left and the right are going to pose new challenges to our democratic institutions, and they may turn more violent. Today, a third of Americans actually believe there will be a civil war in the next 5 years. That's an astounding number. That does not have to be our future. The great majority of Americans don't believe in violence. They believe in democracy, and that's how we settle our differences. So it's going to be up to us to make sure that democracy endures.
Mike, Seth, we thank you both for your time today and on these very important topics. And to our audience, on behalf of CHDS and our co-host organizations, thank you for joining us today. And if you're interested in learning more from Dr. Seth Jones, we're pleased to announce that CHDS will launch an online self-study course next month from Seth as part of our self-study course library. As we close today, we'll share some more information on Seth's course and the other self-study course offerings that are coming up this spring and throughout the year. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good day.